So I just want to introduce a few of our products and services to some of you. I know some of you are familiar with a few of them. A lot of you have been asking questions about our different products and services, which is great. We love to hear from you guys. So I do want to mention that our ESL course, so Learning English as a Second Language, is now open. And it runs for about 2 to 3 months. So if you are interested in learning English and being able to complete the IELTS exam, feel free to reach out. You can register early and there are early discounts available. So please don't hesitate to look into it if you're interested in doing that. We also offer both online and in-person study abroad opportunities that range between 1 to 2 months and typically fall in the summer months. So if that's something you're looking for, we'd be happy to share more information with you on that. You can check out our website. Our website's listed there at the bottom of the screen. You can check out all of our destinations and find out some more. We do have some destinations not listed on the website just yet, but if you are looking for a specific country, feel free to ask about it and we can definitely look into it for you. We also provide virtual faculty-led programs, and one of our upcoming programs runs for about 4 weeks is the entrepreneurship program, and it will be hosted by one of our professors from here in Canada. So if that's something that you'd like to learn more on, how to be an entrepreneur, how to start a business, that's definitely something that you can check out. We also provide online university courses for credit. So this is especially beneficial for those of you who are currently doing a bachelor's degree. So if you're in university right now, there is a way for you to be able to save some money on your tuition by taking some of your courses during the summertime and during the fall. If that's something you'd like to learn more on, we'd be happy to share details on that. There are scholarships available, partial funding scholarships, and it's a great way for you to save money on tuition, but also be able to complete credits towards your bachelor's degree. We do also provide master's programs, which is something that a lot of you have been asking about. So please keep asking. We will get to your questions as soon as we can and share more details on that. Once again, we do provide both tutoring and financial aid for all of our products and services because we want to make sure that all of you guys are successful. So feel free to reach out, and you can do that by contacting us through any of our social media outlets. So you can email us up there at that email address. You can join our Telegram group. We also have a Kakao Talk group and something on Facebook and Instagram. So if you'd like, you can take a picture of this screen and use it for reference later. But we'd love to be able to connect with you and to hear more from you. And now to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Antonio Torres-Ruiz is a senior lecturer at the University of Toronto, both in the Department of Political Science and the Latin American Studies program, and has taught at York University in Toronto, Canada, in the Department of Equity Studies and at the Center for International Studies at El Colegio de Mexico. He is a research fellow at the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean at York, and specializes in democratization, identity politics, global political economy, and globalization, with a focus on Latin America and North America. His publications include contributions for several academic journals, such as Latin American Research Review in the US, International Journal in Canada, a journal in Brazil, Journal of Latin American Studies in the UK, Latin American Politics and Society in the US, Working Paper Series, CIDE in Mexico, and Crítica Contemporánea in Uruguay. Among other book contributions, he co-authored a book chapter and co-edited a volume on contentious politics in North America with the late U of T professor Stephen Clarkson. In 2018, he published a single-authored book on the political economy of HIV/AIDS in Mexico by Common Ground Research Networks, University of Illinois Research Park, and he is currently working on 2 different projects, a critique of the democratization literature in political science with a special focus on the ontology and genealogy of the human rights discourse, and B, a Ford Foundation funded project on Afro-descendants and participatory research in Cuba. So with that, I'd like to be able to turn things over to our guest speaker, and I'm sure all of you guys will enjoy his presentation today on globalization from an international relations perspective. So welcome again.
Great, thank you so much, Esther. Welcome everyone. Great to be here, and as I could see, For some people, it's the evening. So I should say good evening, good afternoon, good morning. As you probably saw, I'm still having a bit of coffee because it's early here in Toronto. It's just past 10. And so we're happy to have you joining us. I'm going to be sharing, and of course I thank Shane as well and Esther for hosting this webinar. She already introduced me, but I just want to say a couple of things about myself. My name is Antonio, and my last name is Torres-Ruiz, and this is a Spanish name, as you can imagine. When I talk about globalization, I always tell people that, of course, for some of us, globalization is very real, is very concrete, because some of us are even global citizens in the sense that we were born in one part of the world, we have family and relatives in different continents, and such is my case. I have family in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, in the US, in Mexico, and here in Canada. So it's kind of hard sometimes to really deny the concreteness of such a phenomenon of globalization. Because we know that for centuries we've been migrating as humankind, but in recent decades in particular, that phenomenon of migration and communications through new technologies have accelerated. And so I want to share that with you and to also understand that often when we talk about a concept such as globalization, we need to understand that there's many different viewpoints because there's so many different cultures. And in this occasion, of course, we're going to be discussing this phenomenon from Canada and in English. So that already constrains a little bit the kind of framework that we're going to be drawing from in order to discuss some of the issues associated with globalization. And of course, the focus of this short talk is to look at globalization from, as the title indicates, an international relations perspective, which is a discipline within the social sciences, but also, and I want to emphasize that from a very strong historical perspective, because that's essential for us to understand what we mean by globalization. So having said that, let me now move on to some of the specific issues that I want to share with you today. First of all, for me, when introducing any concept, when discussing any issues, particularly in the social sciences, one thing that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, if you are studying any related discipline, you have to be clear about what do you mean by a concept when you use a term. Because otherwise, I mean, we can engage in a conversation, but each of us will have a completely different take or our definition will be so different that we won't be able to reach any kind of agreement or even understanding of what we're dealing with. This is particularly important when we talk about globalization, because I want to be discussing some of the terms that I'm going to share with you, but these are just some examples of how there's so many terms that often are coined recently that are not very well defined. And then often, because of social media, people engage in discussions and conversations, sometimes very heated debates, but without clearly defining what they mean. So there is what I call often a cacophony of social media, in the sense that there's all these conversations and people don't really understand what other people mean by some of these terms, but they have very strong opinions. And so some of these terms are fake news. I'm sure everyone has heard that in the last few years. Fake news is everywhere. And I'm sure there's translations to that in many languages. We hear it all the time. We hear more recently, in the last few weeks, there's been a very heated debate on cancel culture, something that particularly in the US has been a phenomenon that, again, it's not new. I won't get into that, but it's a term that all of a sudden everyone is using, and sometimes without clearly defining it. or with different definitions from different people. Then we have alternative facts, another term that has been circulating recently. What do you mean by alternative facts? And I want to use that also to insist on the issue that for this talk, this international relations perspective and historical perspective is based on facts, on historical facts. It's not meant to be judgmental about what has happened in the last few years or decades or centuries, but it's about being fully aware of how we got to the point where we are in terms of globalization today. So there's, in that sense, there is no such a thing as alternative facts. So history, we can learn different about different events, and we can agree on or disagree on the impact of those events. But history, I mean, at least if you study it seriously, there is enough evidence to agree on certain specific facts. And so the term that we're going to be discussing today is globalization, which is another term that has become very trendy, particularly in the last, I would say, 3 decades. But again, there isn't, even within the social sciences, there isn't a full consensus on what we mean by globalization. Because if you take international politics course or international relations courses, like the one that I'm teaching at the moment in the summer for CSO, of course, you review all the different theories, and each theory has a different take on this phenomenon. It doesn't mean that it's a different phenomenon, but it means that you can approach it from different perspectives. Another term associated with globalization is globalophobics. And I will get to that term towards the end of the presentation. But this is basically, again, a neologism or a new concept that was associated with the protests that took place back in 1999 in Seattle against the WTO. And then people who protest the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank were labeled globalophobics. You are against globalization. And that's not really what the protesters and the people organizing were all about. So I'll get to that towards the end. But all this to say that we need to define the terms clearly to understand what we're talking about. So my purpose will be to engage in the definition of globalization, talk about the history of this phenomenon from an international or global politics perspective. And briefly, right now, what I would like to do, because I will just briefly define what I mean by globalization, what international or global politics is all about, the difference between internationalism, transnationalism, international relations and political science, and interstate relations, very, very briefly. But first, I want to open it up to all these participants that are joining us still at this very moment, and those who joined from the beginning, and ask anyone who might be willing to share with us what your definition of globalization is. When you hear that term, what comes to mind? And please don't be shy. I mean, you're not going to be judged about that. You're not going to be graded. It's not about assessing, I mean, your level of knowledge, but it's about understanding that we all have different interpretations of everything that we deal with on a daily basis, particularly when it comes to how we are increasingly engaged globally with other people. And of course, if you have some background in the social sciences, you might have even a more precise definition. So if anyone can share with us, what do you understand by globalization? How do you define globalization? And the other term I would like you to define very briefly is international relations, both of which are part of the title of the presentation. So I don't know, Esther, if there's already anyone sharing with us. Maybe you can read out one or two so that we
got quite a few answers here. So some of the answers are interconnectedness, diversity, just diversity in all forms. Some people say free trade.
Okay.
Yeah, but, and also here somebody asks technology transfer and global interconnectedness beyond geographical boundaries.
Wow. Wow. No, that's great. So most of the elements are there, right? Now, often what happens is that we have to put all these ideas together to come up with a definition. I don't know if there's also something about international relations so far.
I see a lot of world trade, global growth or scale development.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. No, but that already is important because, of course, all these are related. All these ideas, all these terms. So, in a moment, I'm going to share with you a short video on globalization, how it is defined, at least from 3 different perspectives, from international relations as a discipline. And before that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the difference between using the term international versus global politics and international relations versus interstate relations very, very quickly, just to make sure that we are all on the same page. First of all, the difference between international or global has to do that in its in the history of European development, because this is a discipline, international relations and political science. I see international relations as a sub-discipline of political science. But these disciplines originated in the Western world. That's something we cannot debate. Towards the end, I'm just going to say something about whether we can globalize those disciplines or not. But these originated in the Western world. And basically, the idea was that since we saw the emergence of nation states, we're going to look at political relations at that level through international relations as a discipline. So that is that nations are relating to each other and we are interested in understanding how that happens. Power relations, commerce, trade, things that people mentioned. The problem is that, of course, the nation is not the same as the state. The nation refers to peoples. So you can speak of the French nation. You can speak of the Mexican nation, the Canadian nation, the Chinese nation, with all of its diversity. But a state is a political entity. So really we're talking about interstate relations, because there's also different cultures, different groups within nation states. So that's the first clarification. Then more recently, we know that there's more actors, and I will get into a bit more details on that, that there's more actors than simply states interacting with each other. So there's also multinational corporations. There's also non-governmental organizations. There's also individuals interacting with each other more actively. So we need to talk about global politics, because there's all sorts of actors, not just nations or states. And then lastly, the difference between internationalism and transnationalism is that often when we talk about internationalism, it's about states or nations relating to each other. But we know that civil society, us as individuals, interact also with our relatives in other countries, with our friends. Multinational corporations engage in trade also with other corporations. And that is a type of relation that takes place at the transnational level, not the international level, because the government is not necessarily involved. So it's at a different level. So having said all that, I hope towards the end, of course, there's a Q&A. Towards the end as well, I will be sharing my email address with you. If you have some more questions, feel free to email me. Be patient, because if there's so many participants, I might get many questions, requests for clarification. And of course, I'll be happy to answer, but it will take some time. But I will be sharing my email address with you as well. But now, I'm going to move now on to share with you this very short 5-minute video on globalization by the Khan Academy. This is an open source video, and the Khan Academy refers to the Aga Khan, a personality that has also invested a lot globally on knowledge. And this in particular is a very short, very to the point type of analysis of globalization, and then we'll come back and I'll provide you a concrete definition of globalization. So let me just now transition to video that I'm gonna share with you from, which is available from YouTube, so you will be able to also watch it later, again, if you want to. But for now, we're just gonna watch this together and then I will come back.
All right, let's take a look at globalization and some of the theories and different perspectives about it. In general, globalization is the sharing of culture and money and products between countries that is happening because of international trade and advances in transportation and communication. You might think that globalization is
So it stopped?
A recent development, but really, international trade has influenced changes across borders for centuries. Silk and spice trade routes through East Asia that began as early as the 1st century BCE introduced different cultures and linked the economies of different nations, as did the English and Dutch shipping empires in the 16th century. Globalization is also a social process where people become more and more aware of other cultures and peoples across geographical, political, and social borders. The economic interdependence of different countries, as well as advancements in communication technology, and the progress of technology in general have all contributed to globalization. There are many theories of globalization. Let's look at world systems theory first. World systems theory focuses on the importance of the world as a unit rather than looking at individual countries. It divides the world into 3 regions: core countries, periphery countries, and semi-periphery countries. Core countries include areas like Western Europe and the United States. These countries have a strong central government with enough tax to support it. They are economically diversified, industrialized, and relatively independent of outside control. They have strong middle and working classes and focus on higher skill production of material goods rather than raw materials. Periphery countries are those in Latin America and Africa and tend to have a relatively weak government. They tend to depend on only one type of economic activity, like extracting raw materials. There's a high percentage of poor and uneducated people, as well as a small upper class which controls most of the economy, and this creates a huge inequality in the population. These countries are greatly influenced by core countries and transnational corporations, which can harm the future economic potentials of the periphery countries. Semi-periphery countries like India and Brazil make up the middle ground between core and periphery. They are often not dominant in international trade, but they have a relatively diversified and developed economy. These semi-periphery countries can come either from periphery countries moving up towards the industrialized core countries or from core countries declining toward periphery status. The world systems theory is a fluid model, but it is criticized for being too focused on the economy and the core countries, and forgetting about culture or even the class struggles of individual countries. Then we have modernization theory, which proposes that all countries follow a similar path of development from a traditional to a modern society. It assumes that, with some help, traditional countries can develop into modern countries in the same way that today's modern countries developed in the first place. It looks at the internal social dynamics as the country adapts to new technologies and the political and social changes that occur. Dependency theory was a reaction to modernization theory and uses the idea of core and periphery countries from the world systems theory to look at the inequalities between countries. Basically, it is the idea that periphery, or third world countries, are poor and export resources to the wealthy core, or first world countries, not because they are in an earlier stage of development, but because they have been integrated into the world system as an undeveloped country. They have their own structures and features not seen in developed countries and will not accelerate to become a developed nation. They are in an unfavorable economic position that means they don't even have the opportunity to improve and develop. They'll remain poor and dependent on wealthier nations. These are just a few of the theories of globalization. There are lots more that look at culture or social networking, economy, politics, or even goods. The world is now a busy and bustling place where events and things can have an effect around the globe. There are different ways of looking at globalization too. The hyper-globalist perspective sees globalization as a legitimate process, a new age in human history. Countries' economies become interdependent as the nation-states themselves become significantly less important. The many individual countries become one global society, though theorists don't agree whether this is good or bad. The skeptical perspective is critical of globalization and considers today's international processes as becoming regionalized rather than globalized. countries' borders are not becoming less important. The third world countries aren't being integrated into the global economy with the same benefits as first world countries. Skeptics don't believe that the current economy is leading towards global capitalism. Transnational corporations are still tied to their home country, and national borders are as important as ever. Then you have the transformationalist perspective, which doesn't have either a specific cause or a specific outcome. They believe that national governments are changing, perhaps becoming less important, but it is difficult to describe the change so simply. As to the strong stance skeptics take on the marginalization of the third world countries, transformationalists again just see that the world order is changing. Into what specific patterns? They are uncertain, just that a new world order design is developing. They state that there are many factors that influence the change of the world patterns, but that the outcomes of these changes is just not known. Globalization has caused many changes in society. It has allowed for international terrorism and civil unrest as different nations are inundated by foreign cultures. It has also created a world economy where different countries are interdependent on each other, promoting a global community.
Okay, great. So let me just go back to the PowerPoint presentation and make sure that I switch off also the...
In other words, we can't simply return to the strategies of the past.
So otherwise we're going to continue watching YouTube. So we don't want that. So let me go back to the PowerPoint presentation. So that short video gives you a sense. Of course, it's like a crash course on at least 3 different theories and 3 different perspectives on the effects of globalization and the origins of globalization. Of course, as I said before, and if you are also studying the social sciences, sometimes there is frustration because, of course, some people want kind of clear-cut definitions. Okay, this is the right definition, but there is, of course, different perspectives. And you have to then understand where the different theories come from and, in a way, come up with your own understanding of different social global phenomena, based on the knowledge that has been produced. Now, I will share with you one concrete definition of globalization that sort of captures many of these different ideas. And this is a definition of globalization that came up also. This is a definition of globalization that was the result of some years of research. This was a big project that I worked on together with colleagues from Norway, Australia, Mexico, and Canada, that was called neoliberalism and its discontents. And so basically we came up with one definition for globalization and one definition for neoliberal globalism, which I will share a bit later. But this is a definition of globalization that we came up with. This is a phenomenon that has been defined by a great number and variety of actors, ideas, and trends. And it represents the ongoing historical process of increasing cultural, economic, political, social, and technological interconnectedness that characterizes the world today. So this, of course, encompasses many different issues, but basically tells us that it's a historical phenomenon. And what I will emphasize in a moment, even more so, is that it's not new. And we can actually identify the moment in history, in global history, that we can say that the whole planet, all the continents finally were interconnected. Of course, the specifics and the level of interconnectedness has evolved. But if we go back, particularly if you're, because of course, this includes also what is going on today, the technological interconnectedness. The fact that we are all connected through Zoom right now in different continents is also the result of this phenomenon. This possibility of being in communication with people who are far away in different time zones was not possible even, let's say, 30 years ago. It was more difficult, right? Whereas today, most people have access to the technologies that allow for this. So the process of globalization, as I said, and as the definition clarifies, really defines a phenomenon that allows us to also talk about the nature of global relations today and for many centuries. Who are the actors that we are defining, that we're including in the definition there? Well, from states to multiple other actors, such as individuals, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, and the number has increased. And that's why now we tend to talk about global relations or global politics rather than simply international relations or international politics. Different ideas are at the core of that definition of globalization. And those are ideologies, from communism to liberalism, to different normative frameworks, ideas about social justice or equality, inequality. We are all witnessing what is happening at the moment in the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement. That is not unique to the US, because there was also enslaved people of African descent in all of the Americas. So it's a common phenomenon for the rest of the continent. But again, what we have behind are ideas. What are the ideas that people have about what is a just society? And so that also has increased in terms of how the interconnection of the world spreads ideas, right? And then all of a sudden we saw protests in solidarity with African Americans in many other countries, even in Europe. And is defined also by trends. And I'll talk briefly in a moment about colonization, the colonization of the Americas, the independence of the Americas and other countries, other former European colonies, isolationism sometimes, integrationism or integration, interconnectedness, interdependence, and so on and so forth. All these define that phenomenon and have defined that phenomenon historically, because there's been moments in which states want to become less dependent from the international economy. And there's moments of integration. Under the Trump administration in the US, we've seen an effort to sort of put an end to this trend of interconnectedness for political reasons, right? There's also different levels of analysis, and I'm going to try to go a bit faster on this because I don't want to really spend too much time on that, but we can also look at the phenomenon of globalization at the individual level, what impact it has on each of us and how we can have an influence. At the group level, the local level, meaning cities or municipalities, the rural versus the urban, at the state level, and then of course the systemic level. So the fact that we talk about globalization doesn't mean that we're just talking about what happens at that level of analysis, because often what happens at the very local level can have an impact globally. We just don't know what will be the consequences, right? So we need to be fully aware of that. And then of course, from an international relations or political science perspective, we always look at the global political economy. That means that we cannot think only in terms of economics and trade, but we need to think of how the cultural, the economic, the political, the social, and the technological dimensions are intertwined. And so this interconnectedness affects all of these different dimensions. And then you can have different perspectives. A state-centered perspective, which is what dependency theory and the world system theory is more about. You can have the Marxist perspective. You can have a liberal perspective that is focused more on the individual rather than the collective, or the neoliberal perspective, which is the one that dominates the phenomenon of globalization in recent years. So just to add the historical dimension, and not to take too much time, but I want to still touch on a few issues here. The important thing is that globalization is not a new phenomenon, particularly from a Latin American perspective. As I said at the beginning, I'm also Mexican. If you are from Latin America, you're fully aware that that contact between Europe and the Americas was central to the process of globalization, because most of the civilizations in the Americas had no contact whatsoever with Europe or with Asia, whereas Europe and Asia and Africa were somehow in contact, sporadically and sometimes more strongly or sometimes more weakly. But Aníbal Quijano, a Peruvian scholar, has studied this phenomenon from its origins, from the moment of colonization of the Americas and how it led to a new global order by modernity, capitalism, the invention of race, because there wasn't such a thing as race before that. So that was also an invention that was a result of the process of colonization, and Eurocentrism. So the current hegemonic power structure is still significantly defined by coloniality. Of course, colonization is over, but the consequences of that process of colonization are still with us, and we're still going through that. Of course, with some counter movements against that process, but still very much defined by what Aníbal Quijano and others call the coloniality of power. And it's more about how the hegemonic discourse continues to be defined mostly from a Eurocentric perspective. Here you can see and how central the Americas are when you look at the Spanish Empire. That was truly a global empire. If you look at in more detail, and I believe this will be recorded and you will be able to go back to it, you can look at in more detail at this map. And the fact that the Spanish crown and the Portuguese crown were united at some point meant that pretty much they had some control over territory all over the world at some point in time. Just these two countries together, what became Spain and Portugal. New Spain alone included Mexico and what is today the United States and the Philippines. So that gives you a sense of how vast that empire was. The Portuguese had also colonies in the Americas, what is today Brazil, in Africa, and in Asia. Of course, in 1992, when we were marking the 500 years of the encounter of the two worlds, there was a huge controversy. Are we going to celebrate that encounter, or are we going to reflect on the impact of that encounter? And there you will find some interesting bibliography about how different scholars, particularly in Latin America, said, we need to talk about the encounter of two worlds, not the discovery of the Americas, because the Americas were there. They were not waiting to be discovered by anyone. But at that point in time, there was a truly interconnected world through commerce, through culture, and through different political and social phenomena. All of the Americas were colonized by one or more than one European power. As you can see in this map, North America was colonized by the British, the French, the Dutch, and South America mostly by the Spaniards and the Portuguese. I won't show you this map. It will be there as well, because then you could see how Europeans spread all around the world, particularly at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, when the colonies in Africa finally and some in Asia became independent. What is important is to emphasize these concepts. Eurocentrism means a perspective that is imagined, but that imagines modernity and rationality as exclusively European, as if they were exclusive European products and experiences, and we know that that's not true. It was codified in a strong play of new categories, dividing East versus West, primitive versus civilized, magic, mythic versus scientific, and so on and so forth. But this was a very evolutionist, dualist perspective that, of course, had consequences globally. And the concept of coloniality of power can be summarized as the ideology that succeeded in spreading and establishing a European historical perspective as hegemonic within the new intersubjective universe of the global model of power. So that goes back at least 500 years. And so we can go back and see that in the Americas in particular, there were the conquerors and the settlers who were at the highest ranks of society. And then, of course, the indigenous peoples and the enslaved African peoples who were brought by force to the Americas at the lower level. And therefore, when we see the Black Lives Movement in the US, we are not talking about just something that started yesterday. So it goes back centuries, and then we still see the manifestations of that hierarchization of society in terms of how people have access to certain services and goods and products and benefits. And of course, Europe became then the center of capitalism, the controlling trade, and with a structure of global society that was based on that notion of the superiority of the European race. And that had consequences for the rest of the world. And we're still living a part of that, right? So now, what was the impact on knowledge? Well, and particularly this is important for a talk like this one, because as I said, international relations and political science are mostly Western disciplines. So there was almost like an epistemic suppression of other forms of knowing. Whereas we know that there's also political analysis in Asia, in Africa, in the Arab world, but we know very little about that. So when we talk about political science, we're talking about political science mostly from a Western perspective. It's only now that there is an increasing acknowledgement that we need to incorporate all those other knowledges into our understanding of global politics, of globalization, and all these different phenomena. There was also a teleological conception of history, that we were all meant to end up like Europe. So there was this notion of development. Okay, people are backwards and they will ultimately get to the point where all countries will look like Europe. And of course, that's not right. And now there's a lot of opposition to that dualistic perspective. Now I'm getting towards the end of the talk, and I just want to also make a clear distinction between, because often people think of how globalization is not just about the economy, it's not just about world trade. Often people, when we think of globalization, tend to think more of globalism, and that is, it represents the neoclassical economics agenda that defines the so-called Washington Consensus and the economic process triggered by it. It is a system of beliefs, a set of principles, or an ideological movement supported by the World Bank, the IMF, the US Treasury, and the World Trade Organization, among others. So globalization is more than that. When Ernesto Zedillo, and there is also a connection with Mexico, who is the former president of Mexico, reacted negatively against the WTO protests in 1999 in Seattle, he's the one who coined the term, globalophobics. People were not against globalization. We all benefit from globalization. We're benefiting from it right now, being connected with people all around the world. What they were protesting against was just one very narrow definition of the economic dimension of globalization, without looking at issues such as inequality and other issues. And of course, I won't go over that because those ideas come from Europe and from specific philosophers and economists. So it's neoliberal globalism that has dominated the last phase of globalization, because globalization has gone through different phases. And the most recent manifestation of globalization, I would say, not just neoliberal globalism, but globalization is COVID-19. Because pandemics have been happening from the time of the conquest of the Americas. It's just the acceleration at which they spread. The crisis that we're facing is not so much that there is a new pandemic, is that through neoliberal globalism, the healthcare systems of many countries were weakened. So we were not well prepared to face it. And that's really what has made the difference in how we have responded to the crisis. So what has dominated mostly is a notion of economic growth in recent years, instead of development, which is a broader understanding of how societies can evolve, right? Taking into account, of course, the living standards, education, health, and the ability of future generations to also meet their own needs. That is sustainability, thinking of the environment and protecting and preventing global warming. So these are just some final comments. I don't think I need to elaborate much on this because basically it's about the increasing interdependence that we see today, the increase also of global society and organization, transnationalism, increasing inequalities, unfortunately. And we need to be fully aware that not all countries benefit the same from this process of globalization, right? And so there is a need also for more conceptual clarity, and most importantly, I would say, there's a need for plurality in our conceptualizations. So what we need ultimately is what I say is to reimagine a globalized future. And here you can have a map upside down, because we tend to think that the countries at the top, the countries on the north, are the developed ones, are the dominating ones. Sometimes if we just do that exercise, we look at the map like this, then we understand that the center of power is not necessarily in the north or in the east or in the west, right? It's all about perception. And that's an important issue when it comes to a phenomenon like globalization, that we need to engage in a more global conversation on these issues. And then finally, there is also my email address if you have some questions. So hopefully there's still 10 minutes at least for some questions, but any further clarification, I'm more than happy to address if you email me directly.
So we do have quite a few questions for you. I'm just going to read through a few of them. One question here is, do you think that the COVID period has brought the world together in terms of helping one another?
That's a very good question, right? And of course, again, there's different takes on that. I think there's a sense of the need for solidarity. That's clear among some people. Unfortunately, of course, we all depend to an extent on the goodwill of politicians. And then again, of course, this is a more personal take, but it was so unfortunate that this crisis hits at a time where there is an administration in the US led by somebody like Donald Trump. Because instead of cooperating, he withdrew the US government from the WHO, the World Health Organization. At a time, what we need is not confrontation, because this is not about where it originated, who's to blame. It's about we are all in this together, because this is a global crisis, as it was, and I did some research on HIV/AIDS. At that point in time, the first reaction was against, of course, there was a lot of blaming. I mean, why this pandemic, in particular HIV/AIDS? But soon after, there was a clear understanding that the world had to come together and fight this disease together, right? And then the UN created the UNAIDS, the UN institution for HIV/AIDS, to fight HIV/AIDS. And that allowed the sort of organization of different states across continents, and also they included civil society to make sure that access to medication was available for all, not just for those who could afford them. So just to conclude on that, I would say that there is some hope because people were all confronted by this pandemic. There is some push for, okay, we need to come up with a vaccine. Now the issue is, are we all going to have access to that vaccine, or is it going to be again like the poorer countries will have to wait and so many people will have to die? We don't know. But I think to a point that Shane raised before we got started, I think that we all have some agency, because we can also put some pressure on our politicians, our elected politicians, wherever we are, to make sure that they know that we're all watching what they are doing, right? And that they need to support those who are promoting solidarity, and that everyone will have access to the vaccine or the treatment, because it's about some basic need, human need, right? To be healthy and to stay healthy.
Mm-hmm. And the next question to kind of follow up on that, how do you think that globalization will be affected post-pandemic, post-COVID?
Right. No, that's another big question, right? And I think there's a big question mark there, because we don't know what the new normal will look like. For many of us who have families all over the world, we don't know when we're gonna be seeing them again, right, in person. Of course, we know that the airlines have been also experiencing huge losses, right, in terms of profits. So it's already having an economic impact. We know that there's an economic crisis already in place, and it will get worse before it gets better, because it will be also all a matter of how strongly the governments react, how strongly the governments also make multinational corporations understand that they also need to come on board, because this is something that needs to be solved together, right? Because all countries are facing this. So it's already having an impact on the economic side of globalization, on trade, because simply of transportation and all the measures that will need to be implemented before we go back to normal, so that people feel safe to travel. The tourism industry has suffered a lot as well. Countries like Cuba, a country that I know quite well because of my research, depends almost like 40% or more of its economy depends on tourism. So they have suffered a huge blow because of this, right? So they need to restructure their own economic system. But even Europe, I mean, we know that Italy was very seriously affected at the beginning, and Italy, Spain are countries that also depend a lot on tourism, and there's been a huge decline. So that is already having an impact globally in terms of economics, right? And certain sectors of the economy that are even more strongly affected by this.
The next question we have is, although many people argue that globalization is a very good concept, it is said that globalization also impacts culturalism of like within their particular countries. What is your opinion or take on this issue?
Right. Well, yeah, another very insightful question, because of course, I didn't mention that because of course there's so much one can say about this topic. But the other thing that was interesting that maybe there was one of the answers at the beginning that maybe some people associated globalization with Americanization, because often people think in those terms. Okay, there is even a very good book, and I don't remember the name of the author. He's very well known, but a good book like from 15 years ago that it was like on the title there was Mac World Globalization, and I think it was Mac World versus Jihadism, because for the author these were the two sides of globalization, the negative side of international terrorism, but Mac World as the Americanization of culture globally, right? So it's clear that of course through globalization we have certain cultures dominating others, particularly through of course big industries like Hollywood, for example, that produce lots of big blockbusters, right? At the same time, what we've seen, if you look closely, and that's why I was talking about the different levels of analysis, if you look at the local level, there's been also a reaction to that. And so now you see in many parts of the world, people going back to their roots, to indigenous cultures, trying to revive some of those. And that doesn't mean that you need to choose, it's either or. Because you can see that particularly young people can navigate their local culture and a more global one, right? Without necessarily renouncing to their indigenous or their native culture. And one positive thing I would say as well, just to finish with this point, is that globalization, the new technologies also have allowed people to continue to be in touch with the cultures and the people they come from. In Canada, many of us were not born here, but now through all these new communication technologies, we are in constant communication with our relatives, no matter where they are. So we're able to also maintain our languages, and we are exposed to more culture. We can watch TV programs in our native languages, in our mother tongues, which was more difficult before. When the first Europeans arrived in the Americas, they basically said goodbye forever, in some cases, to their families, right? Or at least for long periods. And then they got assimilated and integrated into English-speaking or French-speaking or Spanish-speaking cultures, right, in the Americas.
And the next question here, and I hope I'm interpreting it correctly, it says here, what good has globalization done in reducing the increasing inequality and absolute poverty in the periphery? As experienced by many, it puts the first world in a position of hegemony. How do you feel?
Well, that's another lecture almost, but very quickly. Yeah, I mentioned that towards the end, that one of the downsides of globalization, but let's be clear, and that's why I differentiated between globalization and neoliberal globalism. Because we could have globalization in a more equal fashion. We could all aim to a more global system where solidarity is central, where equality is central. The problem is that the agenda has been dominated by neoliberal globalism. And that, of course, has benefited some more than others. People talk about, okay, in absolute terms, there's less poverty today than a few years before. The age expectations have increased globally as well. That's true. The problem is that the inequality, the gap, has increased as well. And that's what is the problem, right? And in some cases, people have even seen increased poverty. We cannot deny that, particularly in the global south. So something has to be done because there's a co-responsibility. If you're benefiting from this process of integration, you should be willing and able to share the benefits with others. But then that's why, I mean, I didn't get into those details, but there was a point towards the end in my final comments that there's an increasing need for some form of, if not a global government, an increased push for global governance. That is the possibility of a global institution like the UN to make sure that the benefits are more equally on politics. If you have an administration, again, and sorry for going back to that, like the Trump administration, that is basically withdrawing from all these multilateral institutions, and with so much power as the US has, then you weaken the possibility of reaching that point where there is more equality globally, right?
So I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Okay, sure.
So the first question here, how important is localization as we strive for a globalized society?
Yeah, well, another one, because many people say the local is global and the global is local, and it all depends where you come from. But it's true that when you think about how the world functions, even what we think of, anything that we think global is local for somebody. What do I mean by that? That even if we think of Americanization or the influence of American culture is local for US Americans. So the local is not going away, it's not going anywhere, right? So the issue is more, how are you going to be able in a globalized world? And I think the social media has, at least to an extent, democratized also the possibility of having an influence or an impact at the global level. Because now all of a sudden you have YouTubers or influencers who are from other parts of the world, not just the US or Europe, and they become global celebrities, and they bring with them their own culture. And then all of a sudden people are exposed to that. So in that sense, you can see the local going global in a very unexpected ways. Now, the issue is that, will that have a long-lasting effect? Well, it depends on whether the governments or societies, collectives, also put some resources into that and say, okay, if people actually appreciate our culture, let's say a dance move or a certain type of music or certain type of movies like Bollywood, for example, that has been increasingly popular around the world, then there's a possibility of the local spreading around and becoming global, right? So it's not necessarily only one hegemonic culture, but the possibility of even a dialogue between different cultures.
And just one final question, just given the time limits here. So one of the given definitions of globalization earlier on says, ongoing process of increasing interconnectedness. Does dispute or having disputes between countries count as an interconnection?
In strict terms of the definition, yes. Because of course, any kind of interaction, and that's something that is also at the core of political science as a discipline. I didn't elaborate much on that at the beginning. What makes a difference between a political scientist and, let's say, an anthropologist? Well, that we as political scientists, at least the discipline claims to be focusing on the dynamics of power. That is power at the social level, at the state level, at the international level. And whenever human beings interact, regardless of what level you're talking about, there's going to be conflict, or the potential for conflict and the potential for cooperation. Of course, the more interconnected you are, the more you interact with others on a daily basis, the more there is potential for either understanding or cooperation or conflict, because there's also the more competition, right? Particularly in a globalized world, when you include also economics, global trade, because we know that the resources are limited and people have access to certain financial resources to acquire certain goods. So that creates also tension and competition between states, between companies, between individuals. So I would say yes, with increasing interconnectedness, the potential for conflict increases as well as the potential for cooperation. It all depends, of course, how you deal with those tensions, right? For that, you need a strong government or a strong set of institutions that collectively people build to resolve conflict, because you know that it's going to happen inevitably, unfortunately, because that's part of human nature as well.
So I see a lot of other really good questions. Unfortunately, we do not have time to address the rest of them, but it was very kind of you to offer Antonio your email address in case anyone wants to send their questions. So it's on the screen, and he has already extended the invitation. So if you would like to ask him your question, feel free to email him. I just want to say thank you again, Antonio, for your time.
Thank you. No, thank you. And thank you to all the attendees. And as I said, just be patient, because I will answer your emails. But if there's quite a few, I will just have to take some time, right? Because I'm also teaching at the moment and doing a few other things. But I'm more than happy to engage with you by email later on.